Just today, we are going to discuss the downfall of two major companies and how their ethical violations cost them everything. I will be talking about Theranos. Theranos began as a startup of almost mythical propositions and goals in 2003. It's just the incredible mortality tale of how a woman once hailed as a Silicon Valley visionary is facing federal fraud charges. Theranos' founder, Elizabeth Holmes, has now officially been indicted on federal wire fraud charges. The US Attorney's Office accused her of imagining building a company that everyone thought would change the world, but it ended up being one of the biggest frauds in history. Theranos was started in 2003 by a Stanford dropout, Elizabeth Holmes. She fooled everyone, receiving over $600 million of funding in the process. What she promised was a revolutionary bread analyzer that could run hundred of tests from just a prick in the finger. However, this story isn't one of great success or inspiration. This story is about deceit, fraud, manipulation, and a CEO who would stop at nothing to get her goal. This is the story of Theranos, a company once worth $9 billion, and the story of how it all came crashing down in one of the worst disasters in Silicon Valley history. Elizabeth Holmes was born to a well-connected family with a rich history. From a very young age, Elizabeth knew what she wanted in life. She wanted to be a billionaire at age 18, so she went to Stanford Run, where she met a man 20 years her senior called as Sunny. Sunny immigrated from Pakistan and had some success in the dot-com boom of 1999. He pocketed almost $40 million in this process, and she wanted all that money, and she wanted the status of an entrepreneur. So Elizabeth witnessed the SARS outbreak. From that point, she came home determined to change the world upon. She didn't leave her room for 5 days and slept only 2 hours, and in the night she worked on a patent idea. The idea was to create a wearable patch which would continually test the blood of a wearer, and it will also admit the right dose of medicine in real time. So she dropped Stanford at the age of 19 and she started her own company. And the early days were not glamorous as the new company was. Regardless, by the end of the year, Elizabeth had almost $6 million in funding, and her idea had changed now. So she thought the blood testing could be done in a cartridge and a reader system, and the patients would prick their fingers and store the blood in a small cartridge, and this cartridge would go into a machine which would run the test. She envisioned that the machines would perform tests on the spot and beam information via internet to the lab where personnel would interpret the results and then they'll send a report back. But then traditionally how this was done was the patients had to draw a syringe full of blood from a vein and then physically send that sample to a doctor, and then they'll get their results back. So Theranos would always try to scout down components of these massive machines to fit into a box the size of a PC. Theranos was going to make this process faster, more comfortable, and completely bypass the need for a doctor. In the medical field, there are many components that are used to test blood, each of which performs a different type of test. And the problem with FAN is there were several issues that were made the machine nearly impossible. Firstly, the components would interfere with each other when placed in a close proximity due to a magnitude of problems, including heat light, electrical activity, and the test samples could only get a drop of blood from a finger. And these drops of blood had to be diluted and diluted. Some samples gave inaccurate results, and these were outside the detection of the hardware capacity. So all the people who were working on it, all the blood analysts had to report only back to Elizabeth, who literally had no idea on any of this. So in 2006, Elizabeth enlisted engineers to design a new version called as the Edison. However, no machine would be accurate or capable of performing the full range of tests that Elizabeth made. He made the engineering team work 24/7, and when the manager had questioned her, she fired him, and she refused the fact that no one could talk beyond her. And she also hired a parallel engineering team which would work head to head together, and then It was kind of a survival of the fittest race, and this was actually a tactic that was used by Steve Jobs in the original Mac and iPhone. But then in that case, the company would be fired. The but then in that case, the losing team would be fired. And Elizabeth also started doing some ethically questionable things, such as running a pilot test on cancer patients with the company, Pfizer. She knew the product didn't work yet, but insisted on running real tests on people that had serious illness to highlight how serious this was. Blood tests are usually used to increase or decrease a patient's dosage of medication or diagnose conditions which may require immediate action. The only reason the cancer trials went ahead is that Elizabeth had been outright lying to investors and clients about how well the product actually worked the same year the company's CFO discovered that Elizabeth had been lying. He told her to stop instead of agreeing. She fired him on the spot. After this, Elizabeth never hired another CFO, leaving the position vacant for another decade. So, there was no biggest Silicon Valley stars, and Elizabeth has started developing an obsession for Jobs. She loves Steve Jobs, and an employee even found a newspaper cut on the desk where someone called her the next Steve Jobs. The obsession bordered on insanity. For example, when she found out that Steve scheduled marketing meetings on Wednesday, she would do the same with the same marketing firm that Steve used. She would even recruit a few Apple employees, one of which was very close friend of Steve who was working in the technical department, and he later went to join the ethical board of Theranos. Uh, and then Elizabeth had the board wrapped around her finger. She was a master manipulator. She spoke in a low, deep voice in order to be taken more seriously. The question was, as a 19-year-old, how do you go about the process of convincing people that you know what you're doing? It's about finding people who believe in you, because the worst possible thing in the world is to have someone who doesn't believe in you, backing you, because it's not going to be a result in a good situation. On one occasion, she forgot to put on the voice, the deep voice which she had, and she was caught using a natural voice before realizing and dropping several tones. So shortly after the company moved to a prime location in Silicon Valley, and a new member of the sales team soon found out that the financial projections were based off pilot tests that weren't honest. So the issue was brought to the board, who ran an emergency meeting and decided to fire Elizabeth 2 hours after they bought her to tell her this decision. But she had already convinced all of them to reverse it. So this incredible power of persuasion which she had was another reason why she went this far with no real working technology. Elizabeth fired those who raised the alarm to the board, and so at this stage in the company, firing employees was very common. In fact, all the employees who came from Apple would leave in a couple of years. And then by 2009, the Sony, the millionaire Pakistani, was now Elizabeth's boyfriend. And then he also put up a show where he thought he knew, he showed everyone that he knew everything, but in reality he didn't know anything. And then he also said that he had worked as a developer in Microsoft and wrote around 10,000 hours, 10,000 lines of code. But then an average Microsoft developer only writes 1,000 lines of code per year. So he and also constantly kept firing people to let his temper flare. So later, Theranos presented Walgreens with 192 different tests that could be performed by the Edison, but in reality, not even half of them were possible theoretically. And all of this was based on an institute called as John Hopkins Medical School, and this document was only 2 pages long, and there was no actual data results, no actual testing was done, and this shows how the corruption had taken place in this place. Elizabeth also made such an impression on Walgreens that they had trusted every word they said, and she combined Walgreens and Safeway, gave Theranos $150 million in investment in loans around this time. So Elizabeth soon realized that Edison wasn't good enough, so she commissioned the MIDI lab and watched CCTV footage of them to see how people exactly, how long were they working for. And then one time she told an employee that he wasn't working for 8, he worked exactly for 8 hours a day, and then she made him work around 16 hours a day. And basically, who didn't agree with Elizabeth got fired, and who did got promoted. So theranos now had a $9 billion valuation, and Elizabeth was worth $5 billion. She was the first self-made billionaire in Silicon Valley. And the employees are forced to sign confidentiality agreements when they started, and again when they left they had to sign it. This stopped a lot of people from taking action, and many magazines released a front page story titled "The CEO is out of blood," and and Barack Obama also made her the U.S. ambassador for global entrepreneurship. So one day she was invited for a TED talk, and she spoke to the audience about a heartfelt story about how her uncle had passed away from cancer. But of course, the TED talk was merely an act. In reality, she wasn't even close to her uncle, and she had just exploited his death for her narrative. So here's a small clip of Theranos CEO Elizabeth Holmes at TEDMed 2014 in Washington DC about how her company is disrupting lab testing, and also the emotional stories she spoke about.
I believe the individual is the answer to the challenges of healthcare. But we can't engage the individual in changing outcomes unless individuals have access to the information they need to do so. The right to protect the health and well-being of every person, of those we love, is a basic human right. A right defined in the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Yet in the United States today, healthcare is the leading cause of bankruptcy, and the lack of it, the leading cause of the suffering associated with finding out too late in the disease progression process that someone you love is really, really sick. I grew up spending summers and the holidays with my uncle. I remember his love of crossword puzzles and trying to teach us to play football. I remember how much he loved the beach. I remember how much I loved him. He was diagnosed one day with skin cancer, which all of a sudden was brain cancer.
When all of this was going on, the company was already being exposed. The Wall Street Journal ran a pretty scathing article about the company legend. The company's proprietary testing devices may be inaccurate, and basically accusing the ethical practices of Elizabeth Holmes. And they investigated further and found only 12 of the 250 tests were actually possible, and also they gave very inaccurate results. And she also broke up with Sonny, and then she fired him, and a criminal investigation was started. And shockingly, among all this, Elizabeth never apologized that it was her mistake. Like both Elizabeth and Sonny, knew that they were lying to the investors, their clients, and the patients, and even their own board. So no one outside could be blamed for it except the both of them. And she had that such a good mastery in deceiving the board to make sure that 97% of them voted for her to be the CEO. We will never know if Elizabeth's actions could be a case for a modern problem in society, whether they need to be a successful, or at least appear successful, outweighs everything. There's possibly another fault at play here, a fault in the human condition. It's the illusionary effect where if you repeat a lie enough times, people start to believe it, especially if you have credible names surrounding the product. Then Theranos was finally dissolved in September 2018. So one question remains: if they were to keep going, would they have made it to the blood testing machinery ever? It's a harder question to answer than one might think. When they were running out of money, they tested on real patients as a proof of concept to gain more funding, which is of course what brought them down in the first place. But say they did get funding without testing on patients, the unveiled mini lab was only incrementally better than the Edison machine. So we'll never know. But what Elizabeth Holmes has done is ethically very wrong. Thank you.
Today, we will be talking about a very famous company which went under almost 20 years ago. The fall of Enron and how its ethical issues impacted its fall. Although Enron went under and disappeared 20 years ago, the impact on its ethical standards never faded. It took Enron about 16 years to go from about $10 billion assets to more than $65 billion assets, but it took less than a month to go bankrupt. Enron was once ranked seventh largest company on the Fortune 500 and ranked as the sixth largest energy leading company globally. On December 2nd, 2001, they filed for bankruptcy protection in the biggest bankruptcy case in United States. By November 2001, the company's stocks, which was once $90, went down to less than $1. It was a disaster for thousands of employees and investors. Investors lost billions of dollars, and thousands of employees lost their jobs and pensions. So let's discuss what exactly led to their demise. Since the company was founded in 1985, Enron had been a powerhouse for utilities. Enron grew quickly and rapidly in the following 2 decades and became the most prominent energy trading globally. By the end of the 20th century, Enron was given many titles, such as world's leading energy and natural gas companies. In the upcoming years, with increasing market demands and competition, Enron decided to expand its horizons in the international market. By 1999, after introducing fiber optics and broadband market, which was an off-base choice, once more Enron endured excessive loss and significant misfortunes and started draining very rapidly. However, Enron had never released any of this information until October 2001. Instead, during this time, Enron achieved a phenomenal bottom line through overstating revenues and hiding liabilities. For example, revenues for years 1999, 1998, and 2000 were 40 billion, 60 billion, and 101 billion respectively. Before staging and financial statements, Enron never announced its risks like it should have disclosed to its investors. The executives of Enron announced great earning forecasts through the media. They encouraged investors to purchase Enron stocks. They also asked their employees to invest their pension into Enron's stocks. Arthur Andersen, the audit company for Enron, aided Enron in hiding these frauds and manipulations for 5 years. Whenever Enron's employees expressed their concern about Enron's financial status, Enron would try to shut them off and later fire them. Enron would try to make money off these stocks. Meanwhile, top executives gamble and embezzled. The executives also drove up the stock price and put a large amount of money into their own pockets through trading these stocks. Problems came to light in 2001 when the current CEO, Jeffrey Skilling, the CEO, left in 2001 August. In October 2001, Enron reported a loss of $618 million. The chief financial officer, Andrew, was replaced, and Securities and Exchange Commission began their investigation on the company. After 1 month, in late October, the SEC found off-book entities and overstated revenues. Then company stocks went down to less than $1. Finally, on December 2001, the company filed for bankruptcy. Investors lost billions of dollars. Enron collapsed due to its unethical activities led by its executives. Examining unethical shortcomings of as well as addressing their issues can help bring significant insights to this case. Now let's talk. Now let's talk about some ethical dilemmas that were faced by the company, which led to its untimely demise. Honestly, uh, Enron's culture. This culture was extremely competitive. People had to hustle, and the employees were ranked basis of their performance. Enron, the executives didn't care, and they used their power to abuse these employees. They made sure that everyone was working like a machine. They, the employees of Enron were made to work 16 hours a day, and it didn't matter if they were it didn't matter to the executives if the numbers the employees were generating were real or not. Enron's aggressive environments and rigorous performance assessment standards brought a way of life of deception. The employees were worried about dropping their jobs, hence their only goal was the financial goal. After a few employees started to be dishonest with their work, the other employees followed. They found that this was the most efficient way to keep the higher executives out of the way. Gradually, no one felt disgraced about cheating because everyone was doing it. If a person was not being dishonest in the company, then that was considered as odd. This precipitated a subculture of deception. Employees had been measured on their competencies to cheat. In such an environment, the employees had no means to cheat were extraordinary. For instance, a worker who once wrote a memo approximately the truth of accounting issues of Enron. She changed later advised. So now, so now I would like to give my honest opinion on this whole scandal. I feel like this whole scandal could have been avoided only if Enron would have followed its ethical standards. They dropped so low that they basically ended up in jail. A dozen of the top executives of Enron ended up in jail, and one of them actually committed suicide because they thought that there was no way out of the scandal. And it is just so sad to think because Enron was such a powerhouse. It was the seventh largest company of US, and it all came down because of the unrealistic ethical standards. So let's talk about a few things. For example, they would never disclose their losses to anyone. I agree that can bring a bad reputation to the company, but in the long run, it at least seems realistic. Enron had built this fear around itself that made it seem so unrealistic. Investors bought it, of course, because they thought of it as a company that would never fail. And in the end, they failed miserably. Investors lost billions of dollars, and only if Enron had disclosed their losses and disclosed that their business hadn't been going that well and didn't embezzle, it would have been a completely different picture today. Secondly, the work culture over there was extremely toxic. Employees were forced to lie about their work and forced to be at their A game, or else they would be fired. Anything they do or say could get them fired, except for performing well. And the good performance didn't come from good numbers, it came from cooked books. Essentially, a cooked book means changing the numbers to look more profitable so that they could attract more investors. And in the end, they did have a downfall. Thousands of employees lost their jobs and their pensions. And this is a major case of power abuse by the executives of this company. They only cared about the goal, the financial goal, and nothing else. This created a huge power balance issue between the employees and the top executives. The executives would gamble, they would take the share of, they would take unrealistic amount of share into their own pocket, which is unethical again because it has very serious legal consequences, which I'm sure they were aware of, but I'm sure they never thought they would be caught because they were running the scam for around 16 years. It's a long time to run a scam, honestly, and I think those people were brilliant. The people who were behind this whole operation were extremely brilliant that they could run a scam for 16 years, but only if they could uh, use this like use this use their powers or use their intelligence in a better way, they would have been in such a great place today instead of being in jail or awaiting trial. Like their whole reputation is down the drain now, their whole life is down the drain now, and for what? They went bankrupt. And this is what happens with most of the companies which try or attempt fraud. For example, Bernie Madoff, Theranos. There are so many companies that went under. There are few to none success stories in these scams because one, like it or not, it is going to come to an end. The power abuse, the workplace toxicity, the lies, deceptions. Like this company was like made up of lies completely, one top of another. That's how it grew so much in such a short time. And it is just sad to look at right now, but it is again a great case study. It shows us how we think that maybe not disclosing everything is not important, but in this case we can see how it impacted so many people and how it impacted the actually the global economy. uh, they even tried to scam Indians. Actually, they tried to put in power plants in India, but then again, it was their loss because in India, like we are not a really rich country, so we couldn't afford their power plants. So they actually suffered a huge loss because of that. So I would like to conclude by saying there is obviously a factor of greed, but I feel like it's so much more than that. I feel like it's the status, it's the power that comes with it. People hate to admit that they are wrong or they are a failure. Sometimes it's okay to fail and start again. Like a case like this goes like just shows how a few lies and deceptions can uh, come crashing down for you.
It's a tale of two company implosions, past and present. Enron, a Texas-based energy Goliath, went bankrupt in 2001 and wiped out 1.2 billion in shareholder equity. thousands of jobs, and much of its workers' retirement savings. Theranos, once a Silicon Valley darling, fizzled out in the year 2018 after its leader were indicted in a massive fraud scheme that raised 700 million from investors from blood testing technology that flopped. What these firms had in common was a plenty of warning flags waving in front of their leaders, employees, investors, and the media. In each case, only a few whistleblowers and a few reporters stepped up to uncover the truth. By the time the rest of the business world had decided to listen, the damage has already been done. How can leaders learn to spot these warning signs early and stop workplace shadiness before it's too late? The culture of Enron and Theranos were too far down the road of deception and denial for red flags to be properly remediated, but rest of us can benefit from their mistakes. Here are a few red flags that could pop up in other organizations and some advice on how to act on them before disaster strikes. Four red flags to watch out for. Number one, zero tolerance for challenging assumptions. Both Enron and Theranos discourage workers, investors, and the press from questioning their wisdom. While Theranos' punishments were harsher, the company aced detractors quickly. Enron's leader simply turned a blind eye, ignored the criticism, or condensed it, saying critics just didn't understand Enron's sophisticated trading methods. Remedy for that. Company-wide measures to gauge employee sentiment might have been able to get around the C-suite's intolerance for challenge and paint a clear picture of just how much or how little faith Theranos workers had in the company's product. A serious executive, CEO Pamela Wesley, points out in a Forbes article entitled The Theranos Crisis, Where Was the Board? An active ethical board of directors could have demanded answers from secretive company leaders, may have also accomplished the same thing. Theranos had neither of these, but your firm should have both. The second red flag, a lack of transparency and sharing from leadership with employees and investors. Remedy for that. When leadership isn't transparent, employees often have little resource other than to be aware of the opacity and to be on the lookout. Because of lack of transparency, generally signals that something isn't right behind those closed doors. If a company is lucky enough, someone within an inside track blows the whistle early on before the company crumbles. The third red flag. Leaders relied on external actors to justify and hide their actions. Enron had accounting firm Arthur Anderson vouching for it, and Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes crafted a Steve Jobs inspired image that successfully wooed much of the business press. Both had the media trumpeting a message that was too good to be true. The remedy for that. Don't depend on people outside the company to mask your mistakes. If something is rotten, no amount of good PR will cover the stench forever. When a scandal is finally exposed, it will only become an even bigger story for the press. It's better to fix your mistakes early and transparently, if possible. The fourth red flag, putting a premium on ranking in revenue at the expense of quality and integrity. Iran's culture was obsessed with fostering competition to get even bigger results. But there was no value placed on the ways in which those results were achieved. As a result, employees fudged their way to better numbers, which eventually brought Iran down. Theranos had similar obsession, and arguably its fudging happened on a much grander scale as the entire company was built and funded on a non-existent technology. Remedy for that. Making it rain is a core value of many successful companies, but the difference is sustainability. Successful firms don't make it the sole value. Your survival depends on how a culture of or trust and transparent among all employees. Firms that want to make it rain for the long haul will not only tolerate employees who point out errors and issues, but they also encourage and reward reporting. Where is your company on the calamity prevention ladder? The Enron and Theranos disaster shows that failure to actively manage culture and respond to warning signs can lead to behavior and decisions that have devastating consequences for a firm's very survival. Companies can manage this risk by supporting employees who speak up when they see decisions, behaviors, or practice that are questionable. How good is your organization at doing this? Dot level. Speaking up is clearly punished. This was the Theranos strategy, and it failed spectacularly. The lowest rung. You tolerate internal whistleblowing, but stop short of supporting it or encouraging it. This is how Enron treated company vice president of corporate development, Sharon Watkins, who warned leadership repeatedly about accounting irregularities. The second rung. Leader vocally encourages coming forward, but they don't actually support it or value it. The third rung. You encourage and actually value your employees' feedback on questionable activities. That means you see the information when it's brought to you. The highest rung. Your leadership team models, recognizes, and rewards the reporting behavior. To create a culture where people speak up when they should, you really should be striving up for the top rung on this ladder. More than simply not fearing negative consequences for speaking up, employees should know that doing so makes them trusted and valued members of the company.